Now, of course, that's a very basic overview of the different types of drugs that could be used in sport as performance enhancers, and you'd need a much more in-depth understanding to make an argument over it as to whether it's a positive thing for sport or whether it's a negative thing for sport. But key organisations that take a clear stance against performance enhancement include organisations such as WADA, which is the World Anti-Doping Agency. So they aim to regulate which drugs are allowed in sport and which drugs aren't, and what levels of competition they're allowed and what not. And you've got specific companies such as the IOC, so that's the International Olympic Committee. They aim to regulate the use of drugs in the Olympics, of course, so they will run tests to prevent the usage of illegal drugs in sports in the Olympics. And you've got bodies such as UK Sport, who regulate drug usage in sports in the UK, whether that's at national competition level or at lower level. They aim to regulate that and control that as well. So the obvious consequences of drug taking are bans from the sport and your titles being taken from you. But that's in sport in general. Obviously, like I said before, with football, there isn't as much of an issue with drug usage. It's regulated quite well. There isn't many cases in football in history or present day where performance-enhancing drugs have been used. So the drug issues are more prominent in other sports. But like I said, you need an understanding of the types of drugs, the benefits and limitations, and the key organisations before you make an argument for or against performance-enhancing drugs in sport. So again, I'm going to have to look at sport generally due to the lack of usage of drugs in football. If you look at people such as Victor Conti, so he's a clear advocate for the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sport, and he was actually arrested in the 2000s as a result of him supplying drugs to athletes. So there was a scandal involving the use of banned performance-enhancing drugs, and there was a 2002 federal investigation around him. He gave drugs to athletes such as Dwayne Chambers and Kelly White, who were all incriminated as a result of this Balco scandal. He served time in prison in 2005 as a result of his performance-enhancing drug company and the whole scandal. And the athletes that used it were condemned and had their titles stripped from them as well. Victor Conti now does things legally. He sells legal nutrients and vitamins, and actually has a widely used training centre that is used by many professional athletes in the current day. However, he is still an advocate for the use of performance-enhancing drugs. He just no longer has any involvement in them, as far as we are aware. So there are arguments for the use of performance-enhancing drugs and arguments against. So obvious arguments for would be that by using performance-enhancing drugs, you're only making the performance of athletes better. For example, sprinting is a test of how fast athletes can run. The fastest times that have been run are with the use of drugs. So why not allow the use of drugs, as it makes it a true measure of how fast possibly can athletes run? There's also the argument that there's almost a freedom of choice to take it, so it's not really that unfair. If athletes, if they weren't banned from the sport, athletes have the freedom of choice to take drugs. Whether they want to or not is their decision. So it's a fair playing field for if they want to or not. Now, of course, the argument against that would be that the health consequences of those drugs, that a lot of those drugs are potentially life-threatening, which would make it unfair for those athletes who don't want to damage their health and who want to compete but don't want to put their health at risk to compete. Some might argue that because certain vitamins and nutrients are allowed that enhance performance, performance-enhancing drugs should be allowed as well. What is the difference? Where do you draw the line? Caffeine is a very controversial one in that, as it's banned in some sports but not in others, as it could be seen as performance-enhancing. There's a lot of controversy around caffeine, actually, and a massive talking point as well. Of course, the counter-argument for this is obvious. So these vitamins and nutrients have a positive effect on health and not a negative one. The risks of these are nowhere near as high as those anabolic steroids, diuretics, beta blockers, and all those other drugs previously mentioned. Similarly, you can look at certain training conditions. So, for example, hypoxic chambers actually have the same effect as EPO does. Therefore, it could be argued that hypoxic chambers should be banned if EPO is banned. And if they have the same effect, why is one banned and not the other? That's a very controversial point as well, but I suppose it could be argued that hypoxic chambers are a lot safer, as you can kind of regulate things a bit more easily with that type of performance enhancement. Another point for it is that currently having these performance enhancing drugs be banned means that there's an argument that people will still try to take these drugs and enhance their performance no matter what, no matter whether they're banned or not. And if the drugs are banned, then people will be taking these drugs unsafely. They won't have the proper medical guidance of doctors and professional doctors as a result of the ban, as they don't want to be caught, of course. There's the argument that making these drugs legal would mean that the application or taking of the drugs would be a lot safer, and there could be research put into it to make it safe if it's legal as well. But of course, this stems back to the original argument of safety of the drugs initially anyway, and whether the taking of drugs is fair or not. You go back to that rooted argument at the beginning anyway. You also have many obvious arguments against drug use in sport as well. So the obvious one is being put to a disadvantage. If some people are using performance-enhancing drugs and you're not, you're put to a disadvantage, and that can potentially become demotivating as well, because you're seeing these successful performers that are so successful because of this drug, and you're not taking this drug and you're not achieving, which can become demotivating and decrease your participation rates in those sports, especially with people who don't want to take drugs, as they will never be able to perform as well as those who do take those drugs. They have that unfair advantage over people who don't take drugs, which means the people who don't take drugs will become demotivated because they're not performing as well. There's also the very obvious health risks. As soon as you make drugs legal, the use of them is going to become more prominent and more common, meaning there's an increased amount of health dangers as a result of those drugs, as more people will be taking them, and it is harder to regulate as well because there's an increased number of drugs being taken. Additionally, as a performer, if someone wins a gold medal and 10 years later it comes out that they have taken drugs, they are stripped of that title, and whoever came second at the time receives the title. And this obviously has less of an impact. There's no audience anymore for you to receive that gold medal. The sense of winning isn't as strong when you're receiving the gold medal 10 years later. It takes away from those individuals who did win fairly. If there are no drugs in the sport at all, then it creates an even playing field for everyone. No one has any advantages or disadvantages. So it's very obvious from this discussion that there are clear positives to the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sport, and there's no denying that. Whether they're legal or not, there's no denying that it would make people perform better and it would improve performance in sport. However, there's also clear negatives and limitations to the drugs, and the health risk is a very clear one. And the fact that it would create an unfair playing field as well is a very prominent one. So there are going to be both positives and negatives towards performance-enhancing drugs in sport, and it's an ongoing debate that has been going on for an extensive number of years, and will probably continue to be a talking point in sport, especially as people will probably continually be caught using drugs and have titles stripped and things like that. It's going to be an ongoing issue, but luckily in football it's an issue that isn't very prominent. It's an issue that's prominent in sports such as cycling and things like that, but in football it's not seen as much of a problem, which is one positive that we can take. And we are taking positive steps because we have better technology now to catch people who do take drugs and do create an unfair playing ground. So as we progress with our technology, we are progressing in terms of our prevention of drug issues in sport, because we are being able to prevent the usage of drugs a lot more easily with better detection of drugs. You're not only deterring people from using drugs because they're scared of being caught, but you're also catching out the people that do. However, similarly, with the development of technology, there are also developments of ways to mask drug use. Things such as plasma expanders, secretion inhibitors, and diuretics are all methods of masking certain drugs in the body. And as technology develops, there's going to be more ways to mask that drug use, making it unfair. So again, it's an ongoing issue that as we advance, hopefully we will be able to detect drug use and prevent it more easily. Hopefully we just need to stay a step ahead of those who are using the drugs, as I see personally the use of drugs as a negative in sport due to those health risks of those drugs. Of course, main methods to prevent this is we need to publicise when people are caught taking performance-enhancing drugs, as this could act as a deterrent for other people because they are scared of being caught. We need harsher punishments, so if they're caught using performance-enhancing drugs, lifetime bans potentially from the sport, definitely that stripping of their titles. They need harsh punishments in order to deter people from using the drugs.